December 1944. Northern Europe is frozen solid. The skies over France are locked under thick gray cloud, the kind that swallows aircraft whole. Snow clogs the roads, engines fail, men slip, fall, and don't get back up. Along the front line, entire units are blind. No air support, no reconnaissance, no clear picture of what's happening beyond the next ridge. And then the German army strikes, not with a cautious probe, not with a limited counterattack, but with everything it has left. Panzer divisions smash into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. The terrain is terrible, the weather worse, and the Allied front begins to buckle almost immediately. Units are overrun. Communications collapse. Commanders wake up to find their flanks simply gone. At the center of the chaos lies a small Belgian town most people had never heard of before the war, Bastogne. 7 roads converge there. In winter, that makes it priceless. Whoever controls Bastogne controls movement through the Ardennes. Fuel, reinforcements, armor, everything. Lose it, and the Germans can drive straight toward the Meuse River. Beyond that, Antwerp. The Allied supply lifeline. The war itself. By December 20th, Bastogne is surrounded. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne Division is trapped. No tanks, almost no artillery ammunition, medical supplies running out, wounded men freezing where they lie, German armor tightening the ring day by day. Outside the perimeter, panic spreads up the Allied chain of command. This was never supposed to happen. The Ardennes sector had been considered quiet, a place to rest exhausted units, not a place where the fate of the Western Front would be decided. Now, senior commanders are scrambling to stop a breakthrough that could split Allied forces in half. And that's when the question is asked. Not quietly, not hypothetically. Can anyone relieve Bastogne? The room goes silent because everyone knows what the answer should be. The only force close enough to even try is the U.S. Third Army, and the Third Army is facing the wrong direction. It's committed south, engaged in its own operations, spread across icy roads already at the limit of what men and machines can endure. To reach Bastogne, the entire army would need to pivot 90 degrees, advance more than 100 kilometers, and attack head-on into the teeth of a German offensive. In the dead of winter, under constant threat of ambush, with almost no air support. Every experienced general in the room understands what that means. It means shattered supply lines. It means exposed flanks. It means tanks running out of fuel in the snow. It means columns stalled on narrow forest roads, waiting to be destroyed. One by one, warnings are voiced. The weather is too bad. The roads are impassable. The Germans are too strong. The risk is unacceptable. This isn't caution, it's math. Military math says the attempt will fail. And that failure won't just cost a town. It could cost an entire army. Then all eyes turn to one man, General George S. Patton. Patton doesn't argue. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't try to convince anyone that the risks aren't real. He knows they are. He listens to every warning, every objection, every prediction of disaster. And when they finish, he gives his answer. The Third Army will attack anyway. Not in a week, not after the weather clears, immediately. In that moment, the decision is made that will define the Battle of the Bulge and nearly destroy the Third Army in the process. Because what Patton is about to attempt has never been done before. And if even one part of it goes wrong, Bastogne won't be relieved. It will be remembered as the place where an entire army froze, stalled, and died on the road north. The German offensive had a name, Wacht am Rhein, a final gamble. Hit the Allies where they least expected it. Punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, drive to Antwerp, split the British and American armies in half, and force a negotiated peace before Germany collapsed entirely. It was reckless, it was desperate, and for a brief moment, it worked. The Ardennes forest was dense, hilly, and miserable in winter, exactly the kind of terrain Allied planners believed armored formations couldn't move through quickly. That assumption was wrong. German panzer divisions rolled forward under the cover of snowstorms and low cloud, invisible to Allied aircraft grounded by the weather. American units holding the sector were under strength, exhausted, and scattered. Many were new, others were refitting after months of combat. When the attack hit, entire regiments were smashed apart before they understood what was happening. German columns surged westward. Fuel was their lifeblood, and Bastogne sat astride every major road they needed to keep moving. Without it, the offensive would bleed to death in the snow. With it, they had a chance, a narrow one, but real. That made Bastogne inevitable. The Germans didn't just want the town, they needed it. By December 19th, German armor had bypassed strongpoints, ignored pockets of resistance, and raced forward. American units that tried to withdraw found roads blocked, bridges blown, or enemy tanks already waiting. The trap closed fast. When elements of the 101st Airborne Division were rushed into Bastogne, it wasn't a calculated defense. It was an emergency patch, elite infantry thrown into the path of an armored spearhead to buy time. They dug in. They waited. Within days, the ring snapped shut. German forces surrounded Bastogne completely. Artillery began to pound the town. Snipers infested the tree lines. Every attempt to move supplies in or wounded out failed. The weather turned even worse. Snow fell constantly. Visibility dropped to nothing. Inside the perimeter, conditions deteriorated hour by hour. Ammunition was rationed. Food ran low. Medical tents overflowed. Men were wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. Morphine almost gone. Surgeons forced to amputate by lantern light. The wounded begged not to be left alone in foxholes because they knew what the cold would do. Outside the town, German commanders were confident. They sent a message demanding surrender. The reply was just one word: nuts. It was defiance, yes, but it was also desperation. The 101st Airborne couldn't hold forever. Every officer inside Bastogne knew it. Without relief, the end was inevitable. Not because the men would break, but because there would simply be nothing left to fight with. This was the reality confronting Allied high command. If Bastogne fell, German armor could fan out across the road network, resupply, and continue west. The offensive would gain momentum it could no longer lose. The entire Allied advance, months in the making, would unravel. Stopping that required speed. Not days, not weeks, hours mattered. And that urgency is what made Patton's decision so terrifying. Because relieving Bastogne wasn't just dangerous, it required doing exactly what the German plan was designed to punish: moving fast along predictable roads, committing armor into narrow corridors, racing against an enemy that had already proven it could strike from nowhere. Every kilometer north increased the risk of ambush. Every stalled vehicle created a traffic jam that could paralyze an entire division. Every lost hour tightened the noose around Bastogne. The Germans believed time was on their side. So did most of the Allied generals. Only Patton believed time could be beaten. From a purely military standpoint, the plan made no sense. The Third Army was not positioned for a northern offensive. Its divisions were stretched across a wide front, engaged in active operations, with supply lines already pushed to their limit. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, repair units, all of it was oriented south and east, not north. To reach Bastogne, Patton would have to do something no modern army had ever attempted under combat conditions. He would have to pivot an entire field army in winter. That meant more than just issuing orders. It meant thousands of vehicles reversing course on icy roads. It meant traffic control under fire. It meant reorganizing command structures while moving. It meant pushing exhausted troops into forced marches without knowing what waited for them at the end. Every senior commander in the Allied headquarters understood the implications immediately. The weather alone should have killed the idea. Snowstorms grounded aircraft, eliminating air reconnaissance and close support. Low cloud meant German movements were largely invisible. Roads were narrow, frozen, and clogged with refugees, wrecked vehicles, and retreating units. A single destroyed bridge or disabled truck could halt an entire column for hours. Then there was the enemy. The German offensive had concentrated armor, heavy tanks, veteran panzer crews, mobile artillery, units that had been pulled from quieter sectors and thrown into one last violent gamble. Driving straight toward that concentration wasn't bold, it was suicidal. And finally, there was logistics, the silent killer of every offensive in history. Tanks without fuel are steel coffins. Artillery without shells is useless metal. Infantry without food and winter gear simply stops moving. The Third Army's supply system was not built for a sudden 90-degree turn. Convoys would have to reroute instantly, through the same roads the combat units were using, under threat of air attack the moment the weather cleared. Every planner ran the numbers. The conclusions were always the same. The advance would stall. The flanks would be exposed. The Germans would cut the columns apart piece by piece. If Patton pushed too fast, his lead units would outrun their supplies and be destroyed. If he slowed down to consolidate, Bastogne would fall before he arrived. There was no safe speed, only bad options and worse ones. This wasn't pessimism, it was experience speaking. Many of the men arguing against the plan had spent years watching armies collapse because commanders underestimated friction, weather, terrain, fatigue, chance. They knew that boldness didn't cancel reality, it collided with it. And reality, in December 1944, was brutal. The Ardennes was designed to kill momentum. Steep valleys, dense forests, few usable roads, perfect terrain for ambush. German infantry with anti-tank weapons could melt into the trees, strike, and vanish. One successful ambush on a narrow road could trap dozens of vehicles behind it. Tanks would be unable to maneuver. Artillery would be stuck in column. Engineers would struggle to clear obstacles under fire. Multiply that by dozens of choke points, and the result was obvious. A frozen traffic jam under enemy guns. Even Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, hesitated. Not because he doubted Patton's aggressiveness, everyone expected that, but because the scale of the risk was almost impossible to justify. Losing Bastogne would be bad. Losing the Third Army could be catastrophic. That was the unspoken fear in the room. Because if Patton failed, the Allies wouldn't just be facing a German breakthrough. They would be facing it with one of their most powerful armies crippled or destroyed. Patton knew all of this. None of the warnings were news to him, and yet he never wavered. Because while everyone else was calculating what could go wrong, Patton was operating from a different assumption entirely. He believed the only thing more dangerous than moving fast was not moving at all. Patton's confidence didn't come from optimism. It came from preparation. Long before the first German tanks rolled into the Ardennes, Patton had been thinking about the unthinkable. Not because he predicted the exact shape of the offensive, but because he believed in a simple rule of war. If the enemy can do it, eventually they will. The Ardennes was quiet. That alone made it suspicious. While other commanders treated the sector as a resting place, Patton treated it as a question mark. He ordered his staff to quietly study the road networks to the north. Alternative routes, secondary bridges, narrow forest roads most planners ignored because they looked impractical on paper. They were mapped anyway. Contingency plans were written, filed, and never discussed openly. Orders were drafted in advance. Not final, not detailed, but ready. They were the kind of plans commanders rarely admit to making, because they imply a willingness to gamble. Patton didn't hide these preparations from his staff. He hid them from history. So when Eisenhower asked the now famous question, how fast the Third Army could turn north, Patton didn't need to consult a map or ask for time. He answered, 48 hours. The room froze. Not because the number was ambitious, because it was absurd. Eisenhower assumed Patton was exaggerating or posturing. He wasn't. The orders were already half-written. Routes had been assigned. Unit commanders knew that if the word came, they would move. No debate, no delay. That didn't make the plan safe, it made it possible. As soon as the decision was confirmed, Patton unleashed a controlled chaos. Divisions received fragmentary orders in the middle of the night. Axes of advance shifted. Traffic control units were redeployed. Engineers raced ahead to inspect bridges they might need in hours. The transformation was violent. Units disengaged from ongoing fights and pivoted north, sometimes under fire. Maps were wrong. Directions were confused. Vehicles ended up nose to nose on frozen roads, both trying to move in opposite directions. Patton accepted the disorder as the price of speed. His orders were brutally simple. Move. Don't stop. Fix problems on the road. Officers who hesitated were replaced. Staff officers who complained about impossible timelines were ignored. The emphasis was not on perfection, but momentum. Patton believed that hesitation was more dangerous than mistakes. Still, even with preparation, the margins were razor thin. The Third Army wasn't a machine turning on a pivot. It was hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of vehicles, and an endless chain of supplies that could snap at any point. One snowstorm, one blown bridge, one major German counterattack, and the entire operation would collapse. And that was before the Germans reacted. Because while Patton was moving north, German commanders were not standing still. They were watching the roads, probing the flanks, preparing to crush anything that advanced too far, too fast. The race had begun, and Patton had committed everything to it. The movement north was immediate and unforgiving. Columns rolled out before dawn, engines coughing in the cold, exhaust hanging low over the roads like fog. Drivers could barely feel their hands, steel burned to the touch. Vehicles that stalled were pushed aside if they could be moved, abandoned if they couldn't. There was no time. The roads through eastern France and Luxembourg were never meant to carry this kind of traffic. Narrow, twisting, bordered by forests that swallowed sound and visibility. Snow hid potholes, mines, and wrecks from earlier fighting. Traffic jams formed instantly, stretching for kilometers. Military police stood in the freezing dark, waving columns through intersections with numb arms, screaming directions over engines they could barely hear. One wrong turn could send an entire battalion hours off course. Patton's order was clear: keep moving, no matter what. Breakdowns were inevitable. Fuel trucks slid into ditches. Half-tracks lost tracks. Artillery pieces froze in place. Engineers worked with bare hands, metal tools sticking to their skin, trying to get vehicles moving again before the column backed up behind them. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes the column waited, engines idling, burning precious fuel while German artillery searched the roads ahead. The weather crushed morale. Snow fell constantly, sometimes in blinding sheets. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Maps were useless. Landmarks vanished. Units became separated, rejoined the wrong formations, or marched in circles before realizing their mistake. Men slept wherever they stopped, in vehicles, in ditches, in frozen barns. Frostbite cases multiplied. Feet went numb, then black. Soldiers wrapped newspaper around their boots for insulation. Coffee froze before it could be swallowed. And still, they moved. Every hour counted. Patton pushed division commanders relentlessly, but even he couldn't control what happened at the front of the columns. Lead elements bumped into German patrols without warning. Snipers fired from tree lines. Mortar rounds dropped suddenly, forcing units to scatter off the road into the snow. These weren't major battles. They were interruptions, and interruptions were deadly. A single skirmish could delay an entire regiment. A knocked-out vehicle could block the only usable road forward. Engineers had to clear obstacles under fire while the clock kept ticking. German forces began to realize what was happening. They hadn't expected an Allied counterattack from the south. Not this fast, not in this weather. But once the pattern emerged, they reacted aggressively. Roadblocks were established. Anti-tank guns were dragged into position overlooking narrow valleys. The farther north the Third Army pushed, the more resistance stiffened. Speed became both weapon and weakness. Move too slowly, and Bastogne would fall. Move too fast, and the columns would outrun their support. Patton chose speed. But speed demanded sacrifices. Units were ordered to bypass resistance, leaving pockets of enemy troops behind. Flanks were left dangerously thin. Communication lines stretched and frayed. Commanders often had no idea where neighboring units were. In places, the Third Army was no longer a solid front. It was a series of racing columns, gambling that nothing serious would hit them before they reached their goal. And then Patton made a decision that stripped away even the last layer of safety. As the Third Army drove deeper into the Ardennes, the map began to close in on Patton. Routes that looked viable on paper collapsed under real conditions. Secondary roads vanished under snowdrifts. Bridges thought to be intact were found damaged or mined. Detours added hours Patton didn't have. Every alternative carried risk, but one option stood out. A narrow, winding road cutting north through forest and low ground, shorter, faster, and utterly exposed. It ran through terrain ideal for ambush, with few places to deploy armor off the road and almost no room to maneuver if something went wrong. Patton chose it. The decision wasn't reckless, it was calculated. But the calculation was brutal. Accept maximum risk now or guarantee failure later. To use the road, Patton had to strip protection from his flanks. Units that should have been screening for German counterattacks were pulled forward to maintain momentum. Artillery coverage thinned. Reserves vanished. The Third Army was no longer advancing with a safety net. If German forces blocked that road in strength, not harassed it, not delayed it, but blocked it, the consequences would be immediate and irreversible. Vehicles would pile up, fuel would run dry, units would be trapped, nose to tail, in a frozen corridor. And the Germans knew this terrain. They had fought over it before. They understood exactly where to place guns, where tanks could hide, where infantry could vanish into the trees and strike at close range. Patton was betting that speed would outrun coordination. He was betting the Germans wouldn't have time to mass forces at the critical point before the Third Army punched through. It was a race measured in hours. Orders went out to the lead divisions. No halting for minor resistance. Push through. If contact is made, fix it with whatever is on hand and keep moving. Heavy weapons would catch up later, if they could. Commanders at the front felt the shift immediately. The advance became sharper, more dangerous. Scouts stopped probing far ahead because there was no time. Columns closed up, compressing themselves into tighter formations to maintain pace. The forest grew closer. Snow muffled sound. Visibility dropped. Every bend in the road felt like a potential kill zone. German fire increased. Mortars bracketed the road. Anti-tank rounds slammed into lead vehicles. Infantry bailed out into knee-deep snow, returning fire at flashes in the trees they could barely see. Casualties mounted. And still the orders didn't change. Move. Patton understood that if he slowed now, everything he'd risked already would be wasted. The gamble only worked if it was pushed to the edge. Some officers believed they were witnessing brilliance. Others believed they were watching an army being driven straight into a trap. The only certainty was this: the Third Army was now fully committed. There was no easy way to stop, regroup, or turn back. Whatever happened next would decide the fate of Bastogne, and possibly the entire Allied front. The first major contacts came without warning. German units that had been falling back suddenly stood and fought. Anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions along the road, firing at point-blank range before disappearing back into the trees. Mortar rounds fell in tight patterns, zeroed in on choke points the Germans had already identified. This was no longer harassment, it was resistance. Lead Shermans took hits, tracks were blown off. Crews bailed out into the snow under machine gun fire. Infantry fanned out instinctively, moving tree to tree, slipping, falling, forcing themselves forward through exhaustion and cold. In many places, there was no room to deploy properly. Tanks couldn't leave the road without risking bogging down. Artillery struggled to get into firing positions. Commanders fought with what they had in reach, not what doctrine demanded. Radio traffic spiked, then dissolved into fragments. Units reported contact, then went silent. Other units advanced into fights they barely understood, piecing together the situation from sound and tracer fire. German armor appeared in flashes. A Tiger tank at the edge of a clearing, a Panther firing from hold-down positions. Then, gone. The Germans weren't trying to hold ground permanently. They were trying to bleed time. Every destroyed vehicle, every delayed column, every forced detour bought Bastogne one less chance of relief. For the soldiers on the road, The war shrank to meters. You fired at movement. You listened for engines. You followed orders passed by runners because radios failed in the cold. Losses mounted quietly. There were no dramatic charges, no sweeping maneuvers, just relentless pressure. Every hour, the possibility of total blockage loomed closer. The road ahead was never fully clear. It was merely less obstructed than the alternatives. Patton pushed reserves forward to plug gaps as they appeared, knowing each commitment left nothing behind. When commanders requested permission to consolidate or wait for support, the answer was always the same: keep moving. But momentum had a cost. Columns stretched thin. Units lost contact with their flanks. In places, German infantry slipped between formations, striking supply vehicles and rear elements. Fuel trucks burned on the roadside, black smoke rising against the snow. Behind the advance, chaos followed. Engineers worked non-stop, clearing wrecks, repairing roads, recovering vehicles where possible. The pace of the advance depended on their ability to keep the arteries open. One failure, one missed mine, one ambush in the wrong place, and the entire operation would choke. At the front, commanders began to realize how close they were to the edge. A single German armored counterattack, launched at the right moment, could cut the road completely. There were no strong defensive positions prepared behind them, no depth. The Third Army was not advancing into enemy territory, it was threading a needle. And inside Bastogne, the clock was still running. Inside Bastogne, time lost its meaning. Days blurred together under constant shelling. Snow filled foxholes as fast as men could shovel it out. Buildings that still stood were packed with wounded, their windows blacked out to hide them from artillery observers. The perimeter was thin and uneven, stretched across frozen fields and forest edges. Paratroopers manned positions that would have been considered impossible under normal conditions. No armor, minimal artillery, limited ammunition, and no way out. German attacks came in waves, probing, then heavier, then pulling back again. Infantry advanced behind tanks, testing for weak points, forcing the defenders to reveal their positions. Every round mattered. Machine guns fired in short bursts. Artillery was saved for confirmed targets. When shells ran low, fire missions were denied unless absolutely necessary. Medical conditions were catastrophic. Surgeons worked without heat, hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. Morphine was rationed. Wounded men lay on floors, on tables, on doors pulled from hinges. Some were evacuated by hand-drawn sleds when shelling paused, knowing the journey itself could kill them. The weather trapped them as effectively as the Germans. Aircraft couldn't land. Supplies couldn't be dropped accurately. For days, the sky remained sealed shut, denying Bastogne any relief from above. German loudspeakers called out across the lines. They promised safety, warmth, medical care. The response from the defenders was silence, or rifle fire. The famous reply to the German surrender demand was already legend, but legend didn't stop bleeding or hunger. Officers inside the perimeter knew exactly how close they were to collapse. Not moral collapse, physical collapse. Men fell asleep standing, weapons jammed from ice, fingers lost sensation, then function. Still, the line held. Because holding was all they could do. Radio messages trickled out when conditions allowed. Fragmentary reports, requests for ammunition, requests for air support, requests for relief that everyone knew might not come in time. And yet the defenders were not ignorant of what was happening outside. They knew someone was coming. They just didn't know if they would arrive before the Germans broke through. Each night the sound of artillery echoed from distant ridges, sometimes closer, sometimes fading. Every rumor of approaching armor sparked hope, then fear when nothing followed. For the men inside Bastogne, the Third Army was not an abstract force. It was a deadline. If Patton failed, there would be no second chance, no fallback position, no orderly withdrawal, only surrender or annihilation. And outside the town, Patton's columns were still fighting their way forward, bleeding time, fuel, and men. The gap between them and Bastogne was shrinking. So was the margin for survival. By the final days of the advance, the Third Army was no longer operating on planning. It was operating on instinct. Orders became shorter. Objectives became simpler. Get through, get past, get there. The weather finally began to break. For the first time in days, the cloud cover thinned. Aircraft engines were heard overhead, a sound the men on the ground had almost forgotten. Fighter bombers dove on German positions, strafing roadblocks, smashing gun emplacements that had stalled the advance for hours. The effect was immediate. German resistance stiffened in some places, then collapsed in others. Units that had been fighting aggressively suddenly withdrew, unwilling or unable to face air attack without cover. Patton seized the moment. He pushed everything forward. Tanks advanced without waiting for infantry to fully secure flanks. Artillery leapfrogged forward, firing from exposed positions to keep pressure on German defenses. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles under fire, knowing every minute saved might mean Bastogne still stood when they arrived. Fighting intensified. German armor counterattacked along key approaches, trying to cut the road one last time. Shermans burned. Crews fought at point-blank range. Infantry dug in on frozen ground, firing until barrels glowed, then firing more. Losses mounted rapidly on both sides. There was no room left for caution. The Third Army was committed to the outcome, whatever it might be. Then, late in the day, the resistance ahead began to thin in a way that felt different, not weaker. Disorganized. German units fell back without covering fire. Anti-tank guns were abandoned. Prisoners spoke of conflicting orders, of fuel shortages, of commands to hold at all costs that could no longer be enforced. The pressure was breaking them. Lead elements pushed through the last line of organized resistance and surged forward. The terrain opened slightly. The forest thinned. The road ahead, battered, cratered, but open, stretched toward Bastogne. At 1650 hours, December 26th, a Sherman tank from the 4th Armored Division reached the outskirts of the perimeter. The link-up was almost anticlimactic. No parade, no speeches, just exhausted men, frozen and filthy, staring at each other in disbelief. The road to Bastogne was open. The siege was broken. For the defenders inside the town, it felt unreal. Some men cried. Others sat down in the snow, suddenly unable to stand. The sound of friendly engines was enough to push them past the limit they had been holding for days. Patton's gamble had worked, but only just. The relief of Bastogne did not end the fighting. It simply changed its shape. German forces did not vanish when the road opened. They fell back, regrouped, and continued to fight around the perimeter, trying to seal the gap again, or at least slow the buildup of Allied strength. Patton pushed more units forward, widening the corridor, reinforcing the link. Each kilometer gained reduced the risk of another encirclement, but the fighting remained bitter and close. Only now did the full cost of the dash become visible. Vehicles lined the roads, burned out, abandoned, frozen in place. Fuel shortages lingered. Units were scattered, under strength, and exhausted beyond anything they had experienced earlier in the campaign. Casualty reports climbed. Not just killed and wounded, but frostbite cases, exposure, men evacuated not by enemy fire, but by the cold itself. Equipment losses were heavy. Tanks knocked out in narrow defiles couldn't be recovered. Artillery pieces destroyed because there was no time to save them. Commanders took stock of how close they had come to failure. Had the weather not cleared when it did, air support would never have arrived. Had a single bridge collapsed at the wrong moment, columns would have backed up for kilometers. Had German armor concentrated just one more counterattack along the critical road, the advance could have been cut completely. None of those things happened, but they almost did. Among Allied leadership, reactions were mixed. There was relief, pride, and admiration, but also unease. The victory felt fragile, contingent, uncomfortably dependent on luck as much as planning. Patton, publicly, claimed vindication. Privately, even he acknowledged the danger. The Third Army had survived the dash, but it was bruised and strained. It would take time to recover its cohesion and rebuild its strength. The price paid for speed was paid in blood, steel, and exhaustion. And the Germans, having failed to hold Bastogne, began to lose momentum across the Ardennes. Their gamble was running out of fuel, time, and men. The front stabilized. The crisis passed. But the question remained, was it worth it? In the years after the war, Patton's dash to Bastogne became legend. A masterstroke, a display of pure offensive genius, an example of speed defeating strength, and in a narrow sense, all of that is true. The maneuver worked. Bastogne was relieved. The German offensive was blunted. The Western Front held. But success does not erase risk. Strip away the outcome, and what remains is one of the most dangerous decisions made by any Allied commander in the war. Patton did not bend the rules of warfare. He broke them. He advanced into hostile terrain with exposed flanks. He accepted chaos in command and control. He wagered his army's survival on weather, timing, and the assumption that the enemy would react too slowly or too imperfectly to exploit his vulnerability. Had the Germans coordinated better, just slightly better, the result could have been catastrophic. A concentrated counterattack on the main axis of advance could have trapped the Third Army in a frozen corridor, surrounded, undersupplied, and unable to maneuver. Had fuel shortages hit a day earlier, lead units would have stalled within sight of their objective. Had the clouds not lifted, German roadblocks would have remained intact. Had one key bridge failed, the entire dash could have collapsed under its own weight. These are not hypothetical fantasies. They are margins. And the margins were razor thin. That is why so many generals said no. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked imagination, but because they understood that armies do not usually survive on gambles. Patton survived because his gamble aligned, just barely, with reality. Speed beat coordination. Initiative beat hesitation. Preparation beat surprise. But none of those guarantees exist in war. The dash to Bastogne worked because everything that needed to go right did. History remembers the winners. It forgets how close they came to losing everything. Patton didn't prove the mission wasn't suicidal. He proved that sometimes suicide missions succeed, and when they do, they become legend.